Your audience members will have gone through school for being a biblical scholar, but one of the things you just learn is that Yahweh was a storm god. I actually started finding evidence that seemed to contradict that. There are many reasons that I think that Yahweh was originally a sun god. For some reason, the enemy of Yahweh is the sea, or a sea monster. You have a comparison with the sun god in Egypt who fights a dragon of the underworld every night. So to me, this made sense that Yahweh was fighting because at night the sun looks like it descends into the Mediterranean Sea from the perspective of, someone in Israel.
How did the ancient Israelite view the cosmos? How did they view Yahweh? That's what we're talking about today. Dr. Sarlo, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Awesome. So, Dr. Sarlo, can you give us your general background on the topic?
Sure. So I'm a biblical scholar. I have a PhD from the University of Toronto. And my research interests are ancient Israelite religion, in particular early Yahwism, and the ancient Near Eastern context of the Hebrew Bible.
Awesome. So, didn't plan to ask you this. Did you ever get to meet Robert Homestead?
Yeah, he was my supervisor.
Oh,
I had two supervisors, so they were kind of co-supervising me. But yeah, Robert Homestead is very great. So you knew of him?
yeah. So I've done 3 or 4 videos interviewing different scholars and such on his translation of Genesis 1:1, which is like a huge deal in the origins debate and all that kind of stuff. So did
Right, right. I'm aware of, yeah, in the beginning period when Yahweh began to create or something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So did he ever like randomly give you his spiel? Was it that big a deal at your school as it was in the I guess the lay people world?
Uh, no, I mean he has a lot of theories, a lot of linguistic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He's a well-respected scholar, so he's got a lot going on. But I know that he did have some sort of a debate over a blog or something with maybe an evangelical Christian. So he did mention that once or twice, and I think that might have been the topic of that debate. So
Oh, that's funny. I've read that. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, can you give
yeah.
us your general overview of your book?
Sure, yeah. So in the book, I'm basically just exploring Yahweh's character, and I try to determine how his followers saw him. So what kind of God they thought he was. So a lot of scholars. Yeah, there's the book there. So a lot of scholars will look at modern interpretations of God or religion, what modern people think. My research is kind of the opposite. I'm just concerned with the belief of those Yahwehs who wrote the Bible, especially the earliest material. And as for what I conclude in the book, you could kind of say it's controversial, I guess, because I'm challenging sort of what's become an orthodox position, which is that Yahweh was a storm god. So I'm not sure some of your audience members will have gone through school for being a biblical scholar, but one of the things you just learn is that Yahweh was a storm god. And it's not really gone into too much depth. It's just kind of the way it is. But I found that during my master's degree, I actually started finding evidence that seemed to contradict that. I found more and more evidence of a solar nature. So for my PhD dissertation, I ended up arguing that Yahweh was a sun god. And this book is, a lot of it's the same, but I also added a whole new section in my book. But it's based on that dissertation. So basically, I just felt like as an academic, you're supposed to question everything. And I felt that that view in particular was kind of not critiqued enough. It was just kind of so widespread a belief that it was no longer questioned. And so I felt that I had to be the person to investigate it more and give my view, which was that he was solar.
That's awesome. And just to be clear, it's called The Solar Nature of Yahweh, and it'll be linked in the description. Everyone should go check it out. It was a really, really interesting book. I liked it a lot.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So, how would you say that you challenge the scholarly census on the topic.
Okay, yeah. I guess I should start by giving a bit of context behind that. So I think, like in general, it's agreed that by a certain time period, so after the exile, so Second Temple period, Yahweh is kind of the God of everything, or the overarching Lord of the cosmos. So the question then for scholars is, how did that happen? Like, when did it start to happen? How did he become this God? And then what was his original nature if he became this God of everything? So, I mean, these are really difficult questions. To be clear, it's not like it's clear cut, obvious. Um, Obviously, one of the biggest problems is that there's no agreement on when the biblical texts were written. And there might even be more debate now than there was, a few decades ago, because we have this new group of scholars, these usually European scholars, and they'll say that the Bible was all written in one time period, like it was all composed in the Persian period, which is quite late. That's fifth century, uh, and then they'll argue like you can't date a book based on the language in the book. So if you say, you know, this passage looks archaic, there's old Hebrew words here, those scholars would just argue that the scribe intentionally made it look older than it is. So you can never really say when a text was truly written. And on top of that, there's also the question of when a text was originally written versus the date of the version we have in the Masoretic text. So, yeah, that's just the background. Um, Basically, I think that there are certain assumptions that I don't agree with about the way Yahweh's nature is viewed. So, basically, the assumption is that he must have gone on this evolutionary path. So he couldn't have begun as a god of everything. He must have started off small and sort of expanded his, absorbed other gods' characteristics or whatever. Um, and I don't really agree with that being the only possible way things could have gone down. And I think maybe it's based on the popularity, ever since Darwin, we kind of apply this idea of gradual evolution to all different fields and just assume that that's the way everything works. But it's just another one of those entrenched views that I don't think is properly analyzed. Um, so for me, how I'm challenging the consensus, I'm saying that I don't even necessarily think God evolved that much. I think Yahweh um, probably didn't significantly change from the beginning. Um, and so I found the reason I think that is because I found that sun gods in particular are very, very powerful already at the very beginning. So you don't need to explain some sort of evolution if it's true that Yahweh originally was a sun god. So you might not know, like, sun gods weren't just about, giving warmth, giving light. They also were the kind of the judge of the universe. And I guess that was because, as the sun god moved through the underworld and upper world, he was able to witness things that were going on. Then when he went into the underworld, he was able to, uh, see what the realm of the dead, what they were doing, meet with other gods there, discuss what the judgment should be for, in the divine council. So if the sun god made laws and sat at the head of the divine council, in my view, there's nothing higher than that. So we know that some gods must have began as sun gods. So if Yahweh is one of these gods, then he wouldn't have needed to evolve. He would have already been, at the head of the pantheon. So
Clarification question. So
sure.
when you say it, Yahweh was a solar deity or a storm god, uh, I would assume that you're saying that the descriptions that we are given is typical of that, like, I guess the stereotypical way that storm gods or sun gods are seen in the ancient Near East. Is Because it's almost like obviously we can't know what the ancient Israelite writer was thinking except for the text. So is it just that we're text that we're going off of, and that's why you're saying like a description of, oh, it's a solar deity because these three texts say have solar characteristics. Does that make any sense?
Right. So again, I try to find the earliest text, and that, again, I said that was difficult to do, but um, there are reasons to think, and some scholars do kind of widely agree that certain poems, for example, are very old. So I try to see what was Yahweh described as in those before I look at stuff that we know is later. But I think the whole picture of the Bible, depending, doesn't matter when it was written. Um, it's kind of like throughout you can pick any passage and see that that's similar to the way sun gods are described, in the ancient Near East. So,
Wow, very interesting. Okay, so are you telling me that I have to repaint my picture of a Zeus-like god in the background here with a thunderbolt?
uh, no, actually, I think the sun god does have some power over the storm.
Okay. Whew. Okay.
Anyway, yeah.
All right. That's good news. As people will see, I just did an intro based off of this. It's supposed to be Isaiah 27, but
Oh,
that'd been really awkward if I had to change my whole painting.
right.
But anyways, so so what would you say is the normal evidence given for why most scholars think Yahweh is pictured as a storm deity?
Uh, okay, so there's a few things. I mean, there's etymology and then there's textual evidence. So the theory about Yahweh potentially being a storm god, it kind of goes back to the mid to late 1800s, and that's when scholars started to question, is the tetragrammaton, so YHWH, is Yahweh's name really Hebrew in the beginning? Because if it is, then why is there no Hebrew, at least biblical Hebrew verb hawa, which would be what you would expect? So most scholars thought this, like, I am who I am explanation of Yahweh's name probably wasn't reflecting the original and true etymology of the name. And so they found that there's an Arabic verb hawa, and it means to blow, and usually it's about air or wind. So they agreed that, I mean, certain scholars agreed that if this was the etymology of his name, then he was probably a storm god originally, because of the wind. Um, Now, I'm not sure if that is the real meaning of his name. That's something that's like even more complicated. So hopefully in the future I'll figure that out. But the interesting thing about that theory is that in ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the sun god is blown across the sky by these minor wind deities. And actually, in Akkadian, the word for sunrise is, or one of the words they use for sunrise is derived from a verb meaning to blow, napachu. But as far as I know, no one's ever considered that interpretation of the name. So my point is, even if that was the etymology, it's not necessarily showing that he's a storm god. But once this new etymology was accepted, then scholars started to look at certain poems and passages where Yahweh seems to be in control of a storm or certain natural elements that are involved in a storm. So you've got like Exodus 15, Psalm 29, Psalm 68, Judges 5. There's a bunch that you could point to where you find descriptions of Yahweh that you could interpret as, just focusing on a storm. So you have things like Yahweh's voice is in the heavens, or he rides on the wings of the wind. He makes rain fall from the clouds. So seeing those sorts of things, those passages might make you think that he's a storm god.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and he's the cloud rider, and that's the
Mhm.
same thing that Baal is called in Ugarit, which is like, oh well, if he's called that there in that one passage, and then Baal is called in this other passage, it seems like they must be seen as the same type of deity. Uh, but
Actually, can I correct you on that really quickly?
yeah, go for it. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that is kind of like a misconception. I don't know who first said that, but it's not the same word. There's a word for cloud. So cloud rider is something that Baal is called, but actually in Hebrew there's a word that's very similar. That means it means steplands or like desert kind of, and that's what Yahweh is called actually. Is like rider of the steppes, so Steppes. Um, that's the real translation of that passage. But some scholars have argued you should like amend the text to make it fit this comparison with Baal. So
Oh wow, that's
yeah,
oof. Okay, all right. So anyways, thank you for correcting me on that. That's really fascinating. Can you talk about why you do not think this storm deity interpretation is likely?
okay. So yeah, those passages that people cite to say that Yahweh controlled storms, I agree that he does control storms. I mean, it's hard to deny that, but I just don't think that would be evidence that he was originally this kind of like minor localized storm god. So, the average storm, if you think about a storm, you're thinking usually about wind, water, and if there's lightning, then, fire as well. So, to be a proper storm god, you need to have command of these minor deities or minor forces like wind, fire, water. And the only god in the ancient Near East who controls all three of these is the sun god. So, I guess I'm saying that the sun god is the storm god, but when scholars say storm god, what they usually have in mind is this lesser god, you know, um, one that's like subservient to a sun god. So, for example, the Egyptian Amun, or there's a Mesopotamian god Adad, but these are wind gods. They're not storm gods. I mean, you can have wind storms, but when people say storm god, I think they're picturing the whole, a thunderstorm, and that's not. That's something that the sun god would have exclusive power over.
Wow, that is something that I've never heard before. Okay. Uh,
So
mhm.
yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say
Yeah,
that
sure.
in the book, I kind of went in depth looking at two of these commonly cited storm god passages. So I looked at Psalm 18 and I looked at Psalm 29. I couldn't look at all of them, but these are kind of representative of what sort of descriptions you find. So I went through them verse by verse in the book, and I compared each description in those passages of Yahweh with descriptions of other gods in the ancient Near East, so I could see what the comparisons were, what they resembled elsewhere. Um, so I have some. I have a few passages here. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind if I read you just these really brief descriptions of a god, and you see if you can figure out, is it Yahweh? Is it, or what kind of God do you think it's describing?
All right, let's do it.
If you don't mind. Okay, so these are in the book. So here's one. He makes the rain of the sky yield its water.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Yeah, that definitely
Yeah,
that
that's the
seems
first.
like Yahweh.
Yeah, and so it is really similar to something that is said about Yahweh, of course, but this particular description is about the Sumerian sun god Utu, which it's not intuitive. You might not think that's a sun god. So that's the first one. Another one I have here. May everyone praise him together when he raises his eyes and flashes like lightning.
Well, if it's about lightning, I almost want to assume it's Yahweh because that's the stereotype. But yeah, I don't know if we have enough to go off of that either either way, right?
Yeah, and then most people see the word lightning and they're like, that's a storm god, right? So interestingly, that's Utu, the Sumerian sun god, again, that passage is talking about. So thought that was interesting. I got a couple more here. You drive away the darkness and offer your arrows of light.
That doesn't seem like Yahweh.
What kind of God would you assume?
Arrows of light. Well, that sounds like lightning in that regard. Uh, but that is interesting. That I mean, so you do think that's about lightning, right?
Um, Probably, yeah. Yeah, I think usually arrows of light would probably be lightning, yeah.
That's interesting. That because it sounds like maybe uh, that's some like an ancient person saying that lightning kind of looks like an arrow when it's going through the air. That's really interesting.
Right.
I never thought of it like that. But yeah, I have no idea.
And the reason I've chosen these in my book is they do look very similar, or they're almost identical to descriptions of Yahweh. But this one is actually in the hymn to Aten. So it's about the Egyptian sun disk, god of the sun disk, Aten. And then one more. The east wind is open, and a fair path is made, so that he may go forth on it.
Yeah, I have no idea on that one either.
Yeah, so you might think because the wind and the going forth on the wind, again, people would say storm god usually, but it's about the Egyptian sun god Ra or Re, coffin text from the coffin text. So I thought it was interesting that, any of these could be descriptions of Yahweh. And I bet if you read them in the average church as if it was like about Yahweh, I don't think most people would notice. Yet they're descriptions of sun gods. Something you'll hear repeated by scholars a lot is that certain psalms, like Psalm 29, are strikingly similar to passages about the god Baal. And many will even claim these are copies or adaptations of Ugaritic text. And this view goes back to the work of Mitchell Dahoud, who was notorious for exaggerating parallels with Canaanite literature. So I thought I should revisit it because most people cite these similarities, even though Dahoud has kind of been discredited in a lot of circles. People will still cite, like, Psalm 29 is from Ugaritic or whatever. So I thought I would look into it more carefully. And when I did, I found there aren't really that many similarities. And in fact, the verbs and the nouns that are used, in these poems about Yahweh, and then you look at Ugaritic, and the verbs and nouns are completely different. Almost never even a similar word used. So we're supposed to believe that the Hebrew scribes copied or adapted these Ugaritic texts, but also completely reworked the language, even though both are written in Northwest Semitic languages. So to me, it's just not a solid argument about Yahweh being a storm god. And then one other thing I should note is the locations that Yahweh is associated with are very dry places in the steppe lands southeast of Israel. So, for example, Yahweh comes from Sinai, Horeb, Seir, Edom. We don't know exactly where Sinai or Horeb, the holy mountain, was located, but we do know that Seir and Edom are regions in northwestern Arabia, and their storms are very rare, and there's almost no annual rainfall. So I just, logically speaking, I feel it would be strange to find a storm god was the chief god of one of those regions. And uh, the earliest poems about Yahweh coming from these places, they don't emphasize rain or even talk about rain. Usually they focus a lot instead on his rise from the mountain and then the subsequent divine judgment, which is also what we find in hymns from Mesopotamia about Utu or Shamash, who's the sun god and the god of justice.
I mean, obviously, I'm specifically Michael Heiser. He's talked about like, the writer of Psalms. He's trying to make a basically an attack on Baal. Like Baal isn't the real storm deity. Yahweh is.
The thing is that when people say that it's like from Ugaritic text,
Hmm.
they don't cite like side by side usually. And I think in my book I do put a few that Dahoud used to try to argue like these are similar, and then you look and they're not. Like it's like two words that are sort of similar, and the context is not there, and there's no like lengthy passage where you can say, look, it's the exact same or similar. And I think most scholars have now said that Dahoud was exaggerating the parallels, and that they admit that there's no psalm, like the category of psalm, has ever been found at Ugarit. So for us to try to say like this psalm is found at Ugarit, we don't have any psalms from Ugarit. So yeah, it's just not a strong argument.
You argue that in your book that Yahweh wasn't seen as a storm god, but was actually seen as some type of solar deity, sun god. Can you talk about why you think that is?
Yeah, so there are many reasons that I think that Yahweh was originally a sun god. So I'll just go through a few of them. And one of them I think early on convinced me that he was a sun god, or maybe was a sun god, is the fact that in so many Psalms, you find that Yahweh appears in the morning, like particularly the morning is emphasized. So we find statements like, in the morning I will see your face. Um, people waiting for the morning in order to see Yahweh. And also, you have Yahweh rising from the holy mountain in certain poems. So Deuteronomy 33, Judges 5, Habakkuk 3. These are poems that scholars are there's a pretty wide agreement that these are really old, some of the oldest in the Bible. And they're talking about how he's rising from the mountain. And there's very clear, indications that this is solar, especially in Habakkuk 3, where it talks about lighting up all the lands and stuff. So uh, when I looked, I couldn't find any statements that actually contradicted this idea that Yahweh appears in the morning. So some scholars have actually argued that, oh, it's just because people wake up in the morning. So, of course, they're only going to see Yahweh in the morning. But I mean, there's some Psalms that are clearly set during the night, and the psalmist is talking about how he just can't wait for the morning to come because God is basically not there, absent. So this then made me want to look into other passages that are set at night. In It made me discover that Yahweh is rarely present at night, and when He is, you can explain it as a dream, or in some cases, it will explicitly say in the text, like this was a dream, or the person fell asleep, and then all of a sudden Yahweh is there, and then later he wakes up in the morning. So it's kind of implied that it's a dream. And if you compare this with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the sun god is obviously in the underworld at night. So the only way for him to communicate with his followers is by sending them a dream. And there's evidence of that where he actually does communicate with his followers through dreams. So I think the same belief is being reflected in the Bible. And then finally, I would say one that convinced me pretty early on was this notion that for some reason the enemy of Yahweh is the sea, or a sea monster, dragon. And I thought, why is this? And then you have a comparison with the sun god in Egypt who fights a dragon of the underworld every night. So to me, this made sense that Yahweh was basically fighting the sea, because at night the sun looks like it descends into the Mediterranean Sea from the perspective of someone in Israel. Otherwise, to me, it doesn't make sense why a storm god would fight with a sea monster, or the sea. Um, I mean, it could be that I'm coming at it too logically, but I feel like the storm and the sea have a lot of the same elements. So a storm is like wind and water fighting against windy, watery thing. To me, it makes more sense that the light or the fire of the sun is defeating this dark, uh, watery thing. And I think I mentioned earlier that most ancient cultures actually thought lightning was caused by the sun god, or that it even came out of the sun itself. So, yeah, to me, there's many more reasons, but these are just a few of why I think Yahweh was a sun god.
I wanted to ask you when you said that it would be weird for a storm deity to be, I guess fighting with a water sea deity. Uh, why why would this be weird? I mean, we definitely see that with Baal when he fights Latanu, the Baal epic. Gosh, what's that actually called? Uh,
The ball cycle, yeah.
yeah, the Baal cycle. Yeah, so we
Um,
see that. So why would that be so weird when we actually do see that?
that's a great question, and you just reminded me that I had been working on a paper, and I kind of went to something else because I have a paper that I'm writing about that, and it's maybe too hard to get into it too much, but I'll just say a quick thing about it. At the very end of the ball cycle, it's like cut off. There's a big part cut out, but then at the very end, like there's a few passages at the very end, but before that, it's like a big chunk cut out. So the conclusion of the whole thing is like praising the sun goddess. It's praising Shapshu, which is the sun goddess. Sorry, and basically, I think that the sun goddess has a much larger role in the myth than scholars notice, and so I know a few scholars have written on that, but I'm trying to, write something where I try to demonstrate that actually Shapshu is the hero of the Baal cycle rather than Baal. Um, but as Wyatt wrote about before, there's actually three gods that are said to have defeated the sea monster in that myth in different parts. So there's, I think it's Anat, if I'm not mistaken, and then it's Atharat, and then it's Baal, are all said to somehow defeat. I mean, okay, it's complicated because there's the sea monster, and then later, like the second half of the Baal cycle, it's about defeating Mot, which is the god of death. So it actually switches enemies, but I think they're probably, either on the same side or they might even be identified. So I know it's getting complicated, so I don't know if you want to keep this in or not, but basically, it's not just about Baal, even though they call it the Baal cycle. There is other gods that are at play and that are involved in killing the enemy. And then it's interesting that at the very end, you have a hymn to praise Shapshu, which is the sun goddess. So I think we just don't know enough about it, and there's breaks in the text and stuff. So yeah, it's a little complicated, but I'm writing something about that now. So
Very fascinating. Okay, cool. That'll be something that most people haven't heard of before. Okay,
yeah,
so obviously these texts, Yahweh is a sun god. They're seen. Okay, people are aware of them, and you talked about it a little bit. But why are scholars still okay with saying that there are Yahweh or solar characteristics, but they're still considered to be a storm deity?
yeah. So there's different ways that scholars will explain this or try to get around it. And one of these ways, so when you see a description like his face appears in the morning or he's rising from the mountain, most scholars will say, okay, at least I can see that in those specific cases he's being described in solar terms or something like that. And many will just say it's metaphorical language. And I don't really like that explanation just because I feel it's an easy way to discount something. So, for example, I could say Yahweh is a sun god, but whenever he seems to be, a storm god or some other type of god, that's just a metaphor rather than trying to explain why in real terms he's being described that way, because obviously the followers, it would be confusing if they had to figure out which things are really the characteristics of my god and which things were just like flowery language that has no real basis in reality. So yeah, I think it's just a simplistic way to discount the aspects of Yahweh that are difficult to explain. And then there's another group of scholars who argue that all these solar descriptions about Yahweh are from later tradition. So, in other words, they're not original to his nature. And in this case, they will refer to this process. It's a hypothetical process called solarization, but very commonly cited, even though it's not been demonstrated to have taken place. And I think that this is just a result of this evolutionary view that I mentioned earlier. So basically, if you find that Yahweh was a storm god originally, which is what they think, and then you find these solar characteristics, well, that's just part of the process of absorbing other gods' characteristics. So they can just say, this is along the way, he got these characteristics later. But the only problem, or a major problem with this explanation, is that Yahweh already has clear solar features in some of the earliest poetry. So in Deuteronomy 33, which was a main focus of my book and my dissertation, and it's agreed by most scholars to be very early. So he rises from the mountain like the sun. And not only that, there are these minor deities awaiting his arrival so they can receive his commandments about, to help him execute judgment. And this is a clear description of the divine council, so similar to Sumerian and Akkadian texts that I did like a side by side comparison of a Akkadian text about the sun god, and it looks very similar to Deuteronomy 33, 2 to 3, those verses in particular. So to say that, this is a late text ignores this like comparative material and the clear, you know, archaic features of Deuteronomy 33 that I think most scholars have agreed that it is an old text. So, and then I also find it hard to believe that if Yahweh was originally a storm god, that his followers would just accept, you know, he keeps getting these new characteristics, that seem to contradict his stormy nature. So, did he go from being, this dark, cloudy God to all of a sudden bright and pure? Would would you accept that if you were a follower of Yahweh? All of a sudden, he's the opposite of what he used to be. It just doesn't really, I know I'm going at it too logically, maybe, but and then there's also the question of what sun god did Yahweh get these characteristics from and kind of displace? And I don't think that's ever really, you know, nobody really tries to explain that. And so, in other words, if we do accept this solarization process, I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions that, you know, should make scholars more hesitant to just accept.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Okay, so you talk about in your book, you um, what description would you say is explicit to a storm god that is explicit to a solar deity? Um, in other words, um, if we want to be able to differentiate the labels. So, are there any things that we don't see in a solar deity that we do see in a storm god, or is there anything that we see in a storm god we don't see in a solar deity?
I would say because the sun controls the storms, I would say that any storm characteristics can be explained as features of a sun god, but the other way around, it doesn't work. So, God appears in the morning consistently. I don't think we're talking about storms. I mean, storms can appear whenever, and they don't tend to start in the morning, on average. So that one doesn't make much sense. Rising from the mountain, I mean, you could argue that, but then when you look at those passages, it's not just about the rise, but there's a lot of light language with it, lighting up the land in Habakkuk 3. Um, the verbs that are associated with rising are also used for brightness or lighting up things. So any description of a dark god, or if the god is described as bright or pure, I don't think you're looking at a storm god there. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more too, but just off the top of my head, I guess those would be kind of explicit to sun gods. Whereas, again, like I said, a storm god, there's not really such a thing other than a sun god, because unless you're talking about wind storms, then it's a wind god, and that's a minor deity. But
Yeah, so that seems like that's why it gets kind of confusing because you have things that overlap, and maybe that explains why there's this almost confusion in your eyes, at least. So, uh, do you think that seeing Yahweh as a solar deity is some evidence for original people leaving Egypt. I mean, everyone knows that Egypt's main deity was was the sun god, and
Okay.
it's like, okay, if the Israelites are leaving Egypt, it would make sense for them to see Yahweh as the solar deity. Do you think that's any evidence for some type of early people living Egypt?
I wouldn't say that that is evidence. I mean, I do think that there must have been groups that lived in Egypt or Egyptian territory because, of course, it would be strange to have this tradition of the Exodus of your people leaving Egypt if they were never there. So I do think that that has some historical reality to it. But I think that's also different from saying that Yahweh was originally an Egyptian god or something like that because, uh, well, I mean, as you know, you probably know that there's Egyptian texts that mention this location. I think it's probably the northern Sinai where these nomadic groups, the Shashu, lived, and it was called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but like YHW Aleph, I think. So that's very similar to the name Yahweh, and some scholars have rightly pointed out that this has probably has some relationship to the god Yahweh. Maybe the place was named after the god worshipped there, or vice versa. Um, but I just don't think we can say there's any evidence that Israelites worshipped an Egyptian god per se. I mean, Egyptian like the Egyptian god is called Re or Ra or Horus. I just don't see why a group coming out of Egypt would accept the god but then reject his name. So, um, and according to the Bible, Moses it was introduced to Yahweh in Midian, not in Egypt. So, I mean, I think the reason that we generally will connect worshiping sun gods to Egypt, so they'll say if Yahweh was a sun god, then must have come from Egypt because that's where they worshipped a sun god. But I think it's much more of a widespread phenomenon than that. In my book, I actually argue that pretty much all the ancient Near East cultures had the sun god, at least originally, as the head of the pantheon, or if not like nominally at the head of the pantheon, then um, Steinkeller, for example, a Mesopotamian or a Syriologist, he said that the sun god was the de facto master of the universe in Mesopotamia. So that means that although on paper he's not at the head there, he was the he had the most power. He was basically in control of everything. So I think more and more it's being recognized that it's not just an Egypt thing. It's like it's probably I mean even the whole ancient world was a lot of sun gods were very powerful, but definitely in the ancient Near East it was pretty common to have a sun god at the top. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean that makes a lot of sense. As I hope we'll get into here. Uh, when we're talking about the supreme role of the sun, that's a big part of the ancient Near Eastern worldview. Can you talk about that as well as just how else they saw the cosmos?
Yeah. So I do focus on before I get into my arguments about Yahweh as the sun god. I give an overview of ancient Near Eastern cosmology and the role of the sun in that system, because I think it's important to know that before you go and read biblical passages. Because I mean, not only is the material older, but we always learn that you should study ancient Israelite religion in the context of the ancient Near East. So if you're not aware of this context first, then it's hard to see these connections. So basically, when I was willing, like when I first wrote my thesis, I was willing to just take someone else's diagram of the cosmos and use that. But then I found a lot of sort of text that went against some of the nuances in this diagram of the cosmos that most scholars have. So yeah, maybe I'll tell you what the typical ones look like, and you can put up an image or whatever, and then we'll talk about mine how it's different. So Usually, I'm sure most of your viewers will have seen like one of these diagrams. It's like a little, snow globe or something. So you've got like the land is flat and you've got the sky dome over it, and usually the sky dome is like propped up by mountains. So as far as I know, like that, I don't take any, I don't have any problems with that basic shape of what the cosmos look like. But one of the major issues I have is with the water, like how water figures into the cosmos. So most diagrams will show like a vast ocean below, almost like the Earth is just floating on water, and it's really deep, deep water, and it's all interconnected. So a major difference with my version is that these waters are not all interconnected, but are more like distinctly separate into two reservoirs. So fresh water and salt water. I think this was an important distinction, and it was linked to life and death, essentially. So you had sunrise in the east, and this was associated with life, birth, fresh water because waters of life. Um, whereas in the other side, the west side of the cosmos, you had the sunset, which represents death, and the waters of death then would be associated with the west. So salt water was more associated with that direction. Especially that makes sense for places like Israel and Ugarit, where you have the sea right there, the Mediterranean. Um, but another important difference with my version is I kind of have two versions of the cosmos, really, because you have two major mountains in a lot of these descriptions of the cosmos. So in Mesopotamia and Egypt, for example, you've got your east mountain and your west mountain, and these are like the anchors that hold up the sky, or the dome of the sky. And usually, um, the good god or the good forces are in the east and the bad forces are in the west. But for the people that lived on the coast, like Israelites, you had to modify that because there was no mountain to be seen in the west. So you were looking at just the sea. And so the sky dome must have been held up by, some foundation, maybe at the very west horizon that was not like very tall, something like that. But so you got mountain in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and you got like mountain sea in Israel and Ugarit. And I think it's important to have those two versions, like depending if you're inland or on the sea. And then something else that's pretty important, I guess, with my version is that I locate the sun god's palace on the holy mountain in the east. And most people have God, beyond the cosmos, like either somewhere outer space or in some thin layer just above the sky dome. They'll have like God lives out here. But I think that God lived on the holy mountain in the east, and this is where the divine council meetings were held, and this is where his royal garden, the Garden of Eden, was located. So a problem, I think, is thinking that gods lived beyond the cosmos when really there's no description of anything existing outside of this ordered cosmos. If anything, you have the gods always, interacting with us in this universe. And so so my view of heaven, then, people will say, well, where's heaven then? Because of course there is a place that you could translate as heaven, which is, I like to say, skies, because heaven has this connotation of, because of modern Christianity, it's like heaven is way out there somewhere or in a different dimension almost. But heaven is just the skies. So if Yahweh lives on top of the holy mountain, then he is in the skies. um, it's really high up, and so basically heaven can be on solid ground. It doesn't have to be thought of as a mid-air or an outer space place. um, and then, oh yeah, so one more thing that relates to that is that the storehouses of rain and the other elements involved in the storm, they're usually pictured in these diagrams as being above the dome, and they come through little windows or something. So I think these storehouses of the elements were instead in the palace of the sun god, which again was like in or on the mountain, and the rain then would ascend through like the same gate the sun god would come through when he comes from the underworld to the upper world. That gate is where the rain and the other elements would come up into the upper world where humans live. And yeah, there's somewhere in the book where I demonstrate that rain is actually like water that was lifted from this freshwater well or reservoir in the underworld, and it's described almost like clouds are buckets that the god lifts and then tilts over onto the land below.
That's really fascinating. It's really
Yeah.
cool. Of course, we could spend a whole video on that topic right there. Uh, but let's keep going. Yeah. So you've explained how the ancient Israelite has viewed the cosmos. Can you give us some general info as far why you think that they might have viewed it this way?
Um, I mean, simply put, I think they viewed everything as a dichotomy, good and evil, and then from there, everything else, life and death, light and darkness, fresh water, salt water, like I said. So they're trying to create these categories, and I think that is probably just for trying to have control over something that's pretty chaotic, especially in a pre-scientific world. Like trying to figure out how can we understand the world and try to regulate it. I think having these strict categories, even though obviously today we see them as too simplistic or black and white, but um, yeah, I think uh, yeah, that for that from that perspective, it makes sense to have a right and wrong and fit everything into that. Um, in terms of like why they had the gods living in on mountaintops and stuff like that. I mean, you see that also in ancient Greek culture, and then the more I've looked into it, I see that everywhere pretty much is in India as well. Gods live on mountaintops, and I think this makes sense because I mean mountains are on the threshold. They're these liminal places. The peak of the mountain is it's in the sky, but it's also on the earth. Um, and so like even if you're thousands of miles up in the sky, a dark cave in that mountain is in the underworld. And I think that's probably where the palaces of gods were thought to be located, like at the peak, but like inside the mountain. And so, I mean, when you realize the gods didn't live outside the cosmos, that they lived in the ordered universe with us, I mean, where else would they live if not, in the underworld or on a mountaintop, or in this case, both. So I don't know.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. So Uh, you've defined the cosmos as Israelites see it. Can you talk about the significance of the sun and what role that would play in the cosmos?
Yeah, again, it's just about order and disorder, I guess. So for every time the sun went down, the sky got dark, people would feel a sense of insecurity. Like it's almost like they went back to that original state of disorder that existed before creation. So, like, not only do you lose light and warmth, but as I said, the sun god is the god of justice. He's the one keeping an eye on, the bad people. So when he's no longer present, physically present, how can you be sure that you will be safe from evil? Of course, there were like minor gods who kind of, like the stars, for example, they could gather wisdom about what was going on, but it wasn't to the same extent, and they would have to then report to the sun god and stuff like that. It's kind of complicated, but there would have been a general feeling of a lack of safety, I think, at night. Um, but then in the morning, order was restored. So all those bad things or things that you were worried about kind of ceased, and then you can see your God. He can see what's going on. So you can see why the psalmist often will beg Yahweh to save him from the enemy, and then look forward to the morning when he will see the face of God, because like that's your salvation is in the morning. So and then beyond that, there's something that I'm writing another book on right now, so I won't get into too much. But certain people, I mean, particularly kings, had the potential to live forever with the sun god on his holy mountain, if they behaved like according to cosmic order. So, or which righteously ruling their jurisdiction would be a way to work with the gods to maintain cosmic order. So,
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about some objections to your view. So you argue in your book that Yahweh should be seen as a solar deity. One reason scholars have said Yahweh it can't be a solar deity is because Yahweh is the one who creates the sun in Genesis 1 and on in Genesis 1 on day 4. You think that is actually evidence for your view. Can you explain that?
yeah, for the longest time, I didn't know why people felt that was a contradiction. Like that, if God made the sun, then he couldn't be the sun god. I mean, okay, so like when statues are made for gods, the followers will worship the statue, but they know it's not identical to the god. They're worshiping the essence of the god in the statue. So, like, was the statue of Ishtar, or was the planet Venus Ishtar? Because, for example, at night, like, which one would you think was Ishtar? Basically, neither of them was actually Ishtar, but her essence or spirit or wind could be housed in these statues. And in the same way, the gods can house themselves in stars, moon, sun, things like that. So uh, basically, the idea is that a god creates some sort of a cover or a shield for themselves. And in Akkadian, this is what is known as Malamu, usually translated as radiance. And so it's not literally the god, but they're basically always traveling in that shell. So you could look up at Venus and say there's Ishtar, even though you are aware that you're just looking at her external, body. So we know that in Egyptian myth, the sun god was the creator of the sun disk, and like the Aten was not the god, which is, why Akhenaten's worship of the Aten was kind of like it was a heresy, because instead of worshiping the god of the sun, you were worshiping the sun disk itself. So clearly they weren't the same things. It was like a creation of the sun god that he usually would travel in. So I think if Elohim in Genesis 1 created the sun disk, this goes hand in hand with the solar nature. Um, and you also see it, for example, in Psalm 104, where it says that Yahweh is clothed with radiance and wrapped in light. What other light would he be wrapped in other than the sun? So, um, and oh yeah, there's one other one. The Greek version of Psalm 19, I think it is. Yeah, it's Psalm 18 in the Greek, but it's Psalm 19 in the Hebrew. So in that psalm, the sun is described as like a hero who runs across the sky. But so the Greek version's a little bit different. Instead of saying in the skies, God set up a tent for the sun, which is what you have in the Hebrew, the Septuagint or the Greek says he, as in God, set up his residence in the sun. So the interesting question is whether that represents an older or more authentic version of the passage. And if it does, this fits that broader ancient Near East view that the sun disk was like the vehicle or exterior shell of the sun god.
All right, awesome. Yeah, that's very helpful. And that's pretty strong evidence that yeah, the Septuagint where it reads he set up his residence in the sun. I mean, that's specifically saying that God almost like travels around in the sun or lives
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean, it's a
sun.
bit complicated. Obviously, the Greek version Like
Hmm.
we know when the translators translated it from a Hebrew version, it was like second century or so BC. So I think I'm right. Don't quote me on that. But so,
Yeah,
in
that's right.
other words, what version did they have? Maybe they were using a Hebrew version that had been edited over time, and maybe the Masoretic text is older. You can never really pinpoint, again, like a specific date for a text. So I'd like to think that they wouldn't have, like the Greek translators wouldn't have put that in there. It must have been in their version that they were translating, and you'd think they would almost try to like edit it out because it seems to go against, the typical view of Yahweh. So it's strange that that's actually in their version of the Bible, I think.
Yeah, textual criticism is fun.
Yeah.
Okay. So another one is Psalms 32:4. It says, "For day and night your hand was heavy on me, your strength was sapped as in the heat of summer." Can you explain why that might be an issue for your view and why you don't think it is?
Yeah, in my book I acknowledge this as one of a few like passages that could seem to contradict my view that Yahweh doesn't appear at night. So of course it says day and night your hand was heavy on me. So that you might think, well, there's Yahweh present at night. But if you consider that in Semitic, I mean, even in English, if you say someone's hand is in something, I mean, usually you're just talking about their power or control over something. So it's not like people think Yahweh was literally using his hand to day and night, like torment this psalmist. It has to be to do with his power over the individual. So if you look at the greater context of the psalm, he's the person speaking is anxious because he's not sure, basically, if he's still in the good graces of Yahweh. And so that weighs on his conscience, and it's like sapping his power. And they compare it to the heat of summer, maybe because, when you're really anxious, your temperature can rise quite a bit. Or maybe it already was summer, so they were already, hot. So it doesn't mean that Yahweh was physically in his room, so it doesn't go against my view necessarily. Um, yeah, that's all there is to say about that. I think it's just not that great of an evidence one way or the other.
Okay, what's the next? Here's the next one. Exodus 11:4-5 says, "So Moses said, 'This is what the Lord says: About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well.'" How do you explain this one if God is seen as the solar deity, but he's there doing stuff at night?
Yeah, and so actually, I do deal with this in my book as well because I felt I should, put these passages that could appear to go against me out there and try to figure them out instead of, opening the door for someone to say, this view makes no sense because look at these passages. So the more I looked into this, I found that it could be explained. So, yes, in this passage, Yahweh seems to be saying that he will personally go out and slaughter all the firstborn. And it's funny, the event is announced a few times, I think, before it happens. And every time, almost every time, it's the same description. Yahweh says, I will go out and do this. But there's one, I think it's Exodus 12:23, where it says that Yahweh will spare the Israelites by preventing the destroyer from killing them. So this reveals that there's some other entity involved in this. And if the destroyer can be prevented from killing, then he's probably also the one doing the killing where Yahweh wants him to. So clearly Yahweh's orchestrating the event, but who's actually doing it? It seems that there's another figure at play here. And in 2 Samuel, the same character, the destroyer, appears and sends a plague against Israel, again, at the command of Yahweh. And in that passage, he's also identified as a malak, which you could translate angel. Or I like to translate emissary, working for Yahweh. So it's not that rare in the Hebrew Bible to find these divine intermediaries acting on behalf of Yahweh. I mean, in Exodus particularly, you find it quite a bit. Um, like these malakim, they send plagues against the Egyptians. They help guide the Israelites through the desert, and they also show up in other books as well. But like the slaughter of Sennacherib's army, for instance. But there's a lot of it in Exodus. Um, so you might wonder, was Yahweh lying when he said he would do the killing? But I think that basically what we have here is a case where the master or Lord takes credit for the work of his servant. So, for example, I found that Solomon is said to have built the temple, of course, but nobody thinks that he personally built it with his own hands. So, we have passages where craftsmen make the cherub statues and, do all the intricate work to make the temple. But then there's other passages that say Solomon did these things. So yes, Solomon ordered them to be made, but he used servants to accomplish this task. So I think we're seeing the same thing with Yahweh saying at night, I will do this, but then you see he's really just sending out a divine servant to do the work for him. So he doesn't have to be present at night, is my point.
Little intermission here before we answer the last one. Could you talk to people about where people can reach you if you want to do that, or do you have a website and the name of the book and where they can get it?
Oh, I mean, yeah, the book is available on different websites, Barnes and Noble. I think if you just Google the name of the book, "The Solar Nature of Yahweh," uh, you'll be able to find somewhere to purchase it. I mean, the price is kind of steep, so I think that the target audience, I guess, is like university libraries and things like that. Unfortunately, I think there is an ebook version though. That's what I would recommend people get because it's only maybe $30 instead of you know 100. So yeah, I appreciate that. I don't have a website, but um, maybe I have an email, so I can give that to you.
Cool. All right, and you also have Academia EDU. You've got a couple papers on there that people can check out your
Yeah, I
stuff
do.
there.
Yeah, thanks.
Uh, yeah, you have a one paper that you're in the middle of writing about creation is separating, which will be really
Oh
cool,
yeah,
and a lot
yeah.
of other cool stuff. A lot of other cool stuff you're working on. So,
Thanks.
anyways, on page 34, you talked about how God, he travels with clouds of hail and fire. Can you talk about the significance of that?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and it ties into this talk of divine emissaries. So, in Psalm 18, Yahweh is said to travel with, I think it's clouds of hail and embers of fire, something like that. And then a few verses earlier, he's described riding on the cherubs. And there are other passages too where cherubs are either compared to or identified with clouds. So, in this particular passage in Psalm 18, I interpreted the clouds of hail and fire as being two clouds. So one cloud that can send hail and one cloud that can send fire or lightning. And this it ties into a topic that I've written about before. I'd given a conference presentation a couple of years ago about how Yahweh has two divine companions and how that fits his nature as a sun god. So I'll go through that a little bit, but also talk about the hail and fire specifically. So the seventh plague in Egypt, it involves Yahweh sending hail and fire, and the Hebrew words for these things are barad for hail and ish for fire. And so we tend to think of these as just natural elements, but in the ancient Near East, I mean, almost everything was seen as some sort of divine entity, with various ranks uh, you know, of the deity, but there was no such thing really as a strictly like meteorological phenomenon. So this is, I think, confirmed by another account of the same plague. So the seventh plague is talked about in Psalm 78. And in that case, instead of it being Barad and Aish, it says Yahweh sent Barad and Resheph. And so this word Resheph, it's usually translated fire, but the actual etymology of the word is, kind of uncertain. But what we do know about Resheph is that he was a fairly significant god in the ancient Near East, and he was basically the West Semitic version of Nergal, who was a god of the underworld in Mesopotamia. And in Ugaritic texts, we find Resheph a few times, and he seems to have this role in one text of opening the gate of the underworld for Shapshu, which is the sun goddess. So that was really intriguing, especially when I found that in Egypt there are these triad stelas where the sun goddess appears in the center and she has two gods at her side. So Resheph is one of these two, and then there's a fertility god on the other side. So I think it's kind of an east-west thing going on again. So you got the sun god with the fertility god and the kind of death god or plague god. So this role of Resheph as one of the two companions of the sun god uh, is what first clued me into a potential solar identity of Yahweh. So to expand on that, Yahweh often travels with minor deities. Usually they're called cherubs, but they go by many other names as well. So, and he doesn't just travel with them. I mean, they are sort of the drivers of the chariot, and they do his bidding in other ways too. Like I said, sending plagues or guiding the Israelites through the desert. So I found that there are almost always two of them. For example, in Genesis 19, we see that it's like the two emissaries of Yahweh are referred to, or the two malakim of Yahweh. And most people think there's just one angel of Yahweh, but I mean, in this case, we see there's at least two. So that kind of goes against that theory that there's one specific malak or angel of Yahweh. And interestingly, too, in that Genesis 19 story, there's a part where Yahweh sort of mysteriously just departs at sunset, and then he returns at sunrise. So, that kind of fits in with my theory as well. Meanwhile, the two emissaries, they remain in Sodom, the whole night. So anyway, as for the different names of these two helper gods, so I talked about Barad and Resheph, so hail and fire. There's also, the two cherubs, two emissaries, Malakim. And then in Exodus, there's, of course, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, which I think must have some connection, again, to these two distinct um, divine assistants of Yahweh. And then in Habakkuk 3:5, we're told that when Yahweh rises from the mountain, he has two gods, either at his side or one in front of him, one behind him. And the two gods named are Deber and Resheph. Now, so Resheph I already talked about, but Deber is usually translated as plague, but it's also interesting that it's like a metaphysized version of Barad. So if you flip around the letters of Barad, you get this Deber. And in other passages, I found that these two gods are kind of interchangeable in terms of their role as this other god with Resheph. So I'm leaning towards them being the same god. And it's significant for my theory because, as I said, Resheph has a close relationship with the sun god, especially in those images of a triad in Egypt. But there's also the fact that the cherubs in the Bible are these like twin hybrid creatures, and they're comparable to other twin hybrid creatures that work for sun gods, such as you have the Mesopotamian Kusariku. This is bull men, like half bull, half man, that usually have wings as well, I believe, and they guard the Sumerian sun god Utu. And in Egypt, maybe more, much more, it's a much more known thing in Egypt where you have the two Sphinx who often appear with the sun between their shoulders, or, they're holding up the divine sun boat, solar bark, just like the cherubs carry Yahweh's throne. And it's even more intriguing, I thought, that in at least one case, two minor deities that work closely with the sun god in Mesopotamia are referred to as Sarapu and Burdu. So Sarapu is the Akkadian version of the seraph, which probably means fire or burning. You find seraph in the Bible. But interestingly, it's also a metathesis, again, of Resha. So if you rearrange the letters of Sarap, you get Resha. So there's probably something there. And then Birdu, which is the other of the twin gods, that's just the Akkadian equivalent of that Hebrew word barad, which is usually translated hail. So I would argue that these facts fit quite nicely with the notion that Yahweh was a sun god rather than some other type of god.
Really cool stuff. That's awesome. Okay, that's all I have for you. Is anything else you wanted to say before we close off here?
No, I mean that was a pretty thorough interview, so I really appreciate you inviting me on the channel.
Awesome. Yeah, this has been awesome, and
Great.
I can't wait for any potential other interviews that come through this. All right, this is awesome. I hope you have a great rest of your night there.
You too. Thanks.